David wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. The wounds were still too raw, the scars still forming. But for the first time, he could see a path forward, even if it was shrouded in uncertainty. Hey. You know, cheating and the consequences it leaves behind can be absolutely devastating. It's not just about broken trust. It's about shattered lives, hidden truths, and the scars that last for years. In today's story, we'll dive into a situation where a man's life was turned upside down after discovering that his wife's baby wasn't his. The fallout from this betrayal would change everything, and years later, when his wife tried to find him again, the repercussions were far more than she ever anticipated. Stay tuned to hear how this unfolds. David froze as the knock at his apartment door echoed through the silence. He hadn't seen her in years, not since the day he walked away from a life he thought he understood. Slowly, he opened the door, and there she stood, Sarah, her eyes filled with regret and her voice shaking as she spoke. "David," she whispered, "I've been searching for you. Please, just hear me out." His chest tightened, and memories of betrayal came flooding back. Could he even face the woman who had shattered everything he believed in? But before we dive deeper into David's story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you're enjoying this dramatic tale, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story. David Callahan was a man of quiet strength. His calm demeanor grounded the family, and he exuded the gentle confidence of someone who had built his life with intention. His mornings were a reflection of that grounded nature, where even the smallest routines brought peace. The kitchen was his sanctuary, where he could savor the laughter of his son and the companionship of his wife. Sarah was the heart of their home, always bustling with energy. Her laughter filled the house, and her presence created warmth that made everything seem right. This morning, she was in the kitchen, gracefully moving between the stove and the sink, preparing breakfast. Her humming added a soothing undertone to the morning, creating an ambience of peace. Their son, Noah, was the light of their lives, his boundless curiosity and infectious laughter holding the family together. His playful chatter made the home brighter, and together, they painted the picture of a perfect family. But that image would soon be shattered when David unfolded a document that would threaten everything he held dear. David's fingers trembled as he opened the unfamiliar envelope. His eyes caught the bold heading at the top of the paper, DNA test results. Unease spread through him, but he brushed it off, assuming it was just a mistake. Yet something inside him urged him to keep reading. As he scanned the document, his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The percentages and numbers blurred momentarily, but the final line hit him like a blow. Paternity, negative. The words were a punch to the gut. Time seemed to slow as David struggled to comprehend the meaning of what he had just read. His knuckles whitened as his grip on the paper tightened. Noah Callahan was not his biological son. The kitchen, once full of warmth, now felt cold and distant. The hum of the coffee maker, the sound of Sarah's humming, even Noah's laughter, everything became distant and hollow. David's chest tightened as the weight of the revelation pressed down on him. He read the line again and again, hoping he had misunderstood. But no, the truth remained. "Dara," he whispered, his voice barely audible, filled with disbelief and sorrow. The scraping of a chair startled Sarah, who turned to him with a smile. That smile faltered immediately as she saw his face. "David?" she asked, concern creeping into her voice. Setting the spatula down, she moved toward him. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. He just held out the paper, his hands shaking violently. The silence that followed was deafening, heavy with unspoken accusations. Sarah's eyes fell on the document, and she went pale as she read the words. Tears welled up in her eyes, her voice trembling as she spoke. "David, I can explain." The room seemed to tilt, and the familiar surroundings became alien. David's heart pounded, a mixture of anger and hurt racing through him. The life he thought he had, the love he had trusted, was unraveling before his eyes. His voice broke as he asked, "What is this, Sarah? What have you done?" Her words stumbled out in a frantic attempt at explanation, but David could barely hear her. The trust that had anchored their family was gone. replaced by an unbearable chasm of betrayal. Noah's laughter, once a comforting sound, now felt like a cruel intrusion, a reminder of the innocence tainted by this revelation. David's hands shook as he set the paper down, his gaze locked on Sarah, waiting for an explanation that could never make things right. Sarah, still humming as she worked at the stove, didn't notice the change at first. She turned toward him, her smile fading the moment she saw his expression. "David," she asked again, worry creeping into her voice. "What's wrong?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up the paper once more and held it out to her, his hand shaking so violently that it was hard to keep the page steady. "Explain this," he said, his voice cracking with barely restrained anger. When Sarah realized what it was, her entire demeanor shifted. The color drained from her face, and her hands froze in midair before she dropped the spatula with a loud clatter. "David," she began, her voice trembling. "I can explain." "Explain?" David's voice was louder now, raw with emotion, his control slipping. "Explain how the boy I've been raising, the boy I've called my son, isn't mine? Explain how you've been lying to me. How long, Sarah? How long have you known?" "I didn't want you to find out like this," she said softly, tears welling up as she stepped toward him. He took a step back, holding up a hand to stop her. "No," he said, his voice firm and unyielding. David stood frozen, the DNA test in his hand trembling as he faced Sarah. His jaw tightened with suppressed anger, but his voice cracked as the weight of betrayal crushed him. Don't come any closer," he whispered, his voice sharp with pain. "You've let me believe he was mine for years, Sarah. Years. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Tears began to fall freely down Sarah's face, and she clutched her hands together, desperately trying to find the right words. "It was a mistake, David," she said softly, her voice breaking. "I swear it was a mistake. A moment of weakness, and I didn't know how to fix it. A mistake?" David repeated, his voice rising in disbelief. "A mistake? You call this a mistake? You've destroyed everything, Sarah. Everything. How do you expect me to move past this?" "I didn't mean for this to happen," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean to hurt you. Please, David, you have to believe me. I don't have to believe anything." He shot back, his voice shaking with the intensity of his emotions. "I trusted you, Sarah. I built a life with you, with Noah. And now, you're telling me it was all a lie." "It wasn't a lie," she cried, her voice desperate. "I love you, David. I love Noah. That's real." David let out a bitter laugh, his anger rising. "Real? You want to talk about what's real?" "This," he held up the document. "This is real. The fact that he's not my son is real, and the fact that you betrayed me, that's as real as it gets." The silence that followed felt suffocating. Sarah stood motionless, tears streaming down her face, unable to speak. David's chest heaved with every breath as the anger and heartbreak threatened to consume him. "I can't do this right now," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. He turned away from her, the words of betrayal echoing in his mind. "I need space. I need time to think." "David, please." Sarah's voice broke, pleading with him. "Don't walk away. Don't give up on us." But David was already moving, the walls of the home he had built with her closing in on him. He grabbed his jacket and walked out the door, slamming it behind him, the sound reverberating through the hollow emptiness of the life he thought he knew. David paced the kitchen, the DNA test still in his hand. His mind raced, and his emotions threatened to spiral out of control. He turned back to Sarah, his voice cold and cutting. "Sarah, what is this?" He thrust the paper toward her, his hand shaking not just from anger, but from disbelief. Sarah turned to face him, her face draining of color as she looked at the document. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She stood frozen, unable to find the words. David's voice broke through the silence, sharp and accusing. "How long have you known? How long have you been lying to me?" Sarah took a hesitant step toward him, her hands outstretched as though she could calm the storm within him. "David, I didn't mean for you to find out like this. I was going to tell you." "Tell me?" David's voice rose with hurt and rage. "Tell me what, Sarah? That the boy I've raised, loved, and called my son isn't mine? That you've been keeping this from me for God knows how long? Sarah's hands shook as she moved closer. David, it was a mistake. I made a terrible, horrible mistake. Please, just let me explain. David's voice was filled with disbelief. Explain? You think this is just a mistake? You think this is something that can be explained away? Do you even understand what you've done? You've destroyed everything, Sarah. Everything. Tears spilled freely from Sarah's eyes now, her voice breaking as she tried to hold herself together. David, I know I've hurt you. I've hurt us, but I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't want to lose you. David let out a bitter laugh, his voice tinged with sarcasm. You thought you could just sweep this under the rug and everything would be fine? You let me build my life around a lie, around Noah. And now you want me to just what? Pretend this never happened? I wasn't trying to deceive you, David. Sarah's voice trembled, but her words were desperate. I swear I wasn't. She stopped herself, her voice failing. David slammed the paper onto the counter, cutting her off. Then what were you trying to do, Sarah? Because from where I'm standing, all I see is a betrayal so deep, I don't even recognize you anymore. Sarah stepped forward again, trembling as she gripped the edge of the counter for support. David, it wasn't like that. I was lonely. You were working so much. We were drifting apart, and don't you dare blame this on me. David's voice rose again, full of raw anger. Don't you dare try to make this my fault. I'm not blaming you, Sarah said softly, her hands trembling. I'm just trying to make you understand. I made a mistake, David. I was weak. I let my insecurities get the better of me. But it wasn't planned. It wasn't meant to hurt you. David's voice cracked, his anger barely masking the deep hurt beneath it. You didn't mean to hurt me? Sarah, this isn't just about me. It's about Noah. Did you ever stop to think about him? About how this would affect him if the truth came out? Sarah's tears fell freely as she looked at him, each drop a sign of her guilt. I thought about it every single day. I was terrified of losing you, of losing the family we'd built. David's chest tightened, his emotions overwhelming him as he looked at the woman he once loved. His eyes searched hers, but it wasn't enough to erase the betrayal. You should have been terrified, he whispered harshly. Terrified of what keeping the secret would do to us. You didn't just make a mistake, Sarah. You made a choice. And now, we all have to live with the consequences. Sarah collapsed onto the floor, her sobs racking her body as she covered her face with her hands. David, I'm sorry, she cried through her tears. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am so sorry. I'll do anything to make this right. Please, don't walk away from us. Don't walk away from Noah. David stared down at her, his heart torn between the love he once felt and the unbearable weight of her betrayal. I don't even know who you are anymore, Sarah, he whispered, his voice hollow. And I don't know if I can stay in a marriage built on lies. Right now, I need space. I need time to figure out what the hell I'm supposed to do with the pieces you've left me. Sarah looked up, her tear-streaked face filled with despair. David, please don't give up on us. Don't give up on him. But David turned away, unable to look at her any longer. I've already lost so much, Sarah. Don't ask me to lose myself. Too, he said, his voice strained with pain. He walked out of the kitchen, leaving Sarah broken on the floor, the sound of her sobs echoing in the house. A house that now felt irreparably shattered. David stumbled out the front door, the door slamming shut behind him with a force that echoed through the quiet morning air. He hadn't even grabbed his jacket, the chill biting at his skin as he stood on the steps. His breath came in short, shallow bursts as his mind swirled with disbelief and anger. The weight of the truth pressed down on his chest, suffocating him with every passing second. His feet moved instinctively, though he had no idea where he was going. The streets were alive with the usual morning bustle, but the normalcy around him seemed to mock his turmoil. A jogger passed by, earbuds in, oblivious to the man whose world had just fallen apart. A mother pushed a stroller, chatting away on her phone, her laughter grating against the rawness of David's emotions. David's gaze darted around, taking in the scenes of life, continuing as if nothing had changed. But for him, everything had changed. The ground beneath his feet felt unsteady, as though he were teetering on the edge of a cliff. His heart ached with a hollow emptiness that refused to let him breathe fully. The world around him blurred, the sounds of cars passing and distant chatter becoming a dull hum. All he could hear was Sarah's tearful confessions, her words replaying in his mind like a broken record. The streets, with their bright storefronts and holiday decorations, felt alien to him. Everything was a reminder of what he had lost. He paused at the edge of a crosswalk, watching his car stopped at a red light, its lights blinking in a predictable rhythm. The simplicity of it, the order of it all, felt cruel. How could life move on so effortlessly when his own had come to a screeching halt? He felt like an outsider, a ghost walking through a world that no longer made sense. David clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he fought to keep the tears at bay. He couldn't cry, not here, not now. Instead, he kept walking, his feet carrying him further from the home that no longer felt like his own. When he reached his new apartment, it was a stark contrast to the home he had left behind. Small, sparsely furnished, and devoid of any warmth, the apartment felt cold and empty. The walls were a dull, off-white, and the single window overlooked an alley. The threadbare couch in the corner, a cheap dining table with mismatched chairs, and a bed pushed against the wall were all he could bring himself to accept. The silence was deafening. There was no laughter from Noah, no comforting presence of Sarah. The small noises that used to fill his life were gone, leaving only a void that he couldn't escape. He sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the empty walls. The echoes of his family's life, the mornings making pancakes, the bedtime stories with Noah, the shared glances with Sarah, played in his mind like a cruel film he couldn't stop. Every night, he lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling. The silence only amplified the thoughts and memories that refused to leave him. He had left the house to escape the betrayal, but here, in this barren apartment, he was alone with it. The reality of what he had lost was suffocating. David picked up his phone, scrolling through old photos of Noah. One photo showed them at the park, Noah grinning widely as he sat on David's shoulders. Another captured Noah proudly holding up a drawing for Father's Day, the words "Best Dad" written in crayon at the top. The memories were like daggers, each one a reminder of the bond he had once believed was unbreakable. He set the phone down, unable to look at it any longer. The weight of the truth. Noah was not his son by blood, pressed on him like a physical burden. But it wasn't just the DNA test that hurt. It was everything else. The life he had built, the love he had trusted, now felt like a lie, and David didn't know if he could ever rebuild from this. The weight of the lies hung heavily over David, the years of devotion now shattered by the betrayal. His heart ached as memories of Noah's small hands gripping his as they walked to school, of the joy in his son's eyes when he scored a goal at soccer practice, flooded his mind. How could any of it have been a lie? The apartment, which was supposed to be his fresh start, only felt colder with each passing day. David avoided unpacking most of his belongings. The act felt too permanent, like settling in would mean admitting that his old life, the life he once shared with Sarah and Noah, was truly over. He ate his meals alone at the small table, the scraping of his fork against the plate the only noise in the room. He threw himself into long work hours, hoping to drown out the pain. But even there, the memories haunted him. A coworker mentioning their son's first baseball game, a child laughing on the street. It all reminded him of Noah's laughter, his trust. One sleepless night, David sat by the window, the cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. The world outside continued on, unaware of the storm inside him. A father walked by, holding his daughter's hand, their quiet conversation interrupted by her laughter. David's chest tightened as he imagined Noah in the girl's place, his small hand in David's. The apartment, silent and hollow, felt like a prison, a constant reminder of everything he had lost. He couldn't escape the memories, no matter how hard he tried. Each moment alone forced him to face the truth. His family was gone, shattered by lies he couldn't forgive. He thought of Sarah's tearful pleas, her desperate attempts to fix what she had broken. But forgiveness felt impossible. How could he forgive the woman who had stolen the one thing he had loved most? His son. Yet it wasn't Sarah's face that haunted him the most. It was Noah's. The boy who had trusted him, who had called him dad, even after the truth came crashing down. David buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed by the weight of his emotions. He didn't know how to move forward. The pain was too fresh, too raw. All he could do was sit in the silence, hoping that someday the emptiness wouldn't feel so heavy. The knock on the door startled him from his thoughts. He glanced at the clock, late, and he wasn't expecting anyone. Reluctantly, he rose from the couch, the floor creaking beneath his weight. When he opened the door, he was met with a familiar face. "Lily," he said, his voice a mix of surprise and irritation. Sarah's best friend stood there, her expression soft yet determined. "David," she replied gently, "can I come in?" He hesitated, the instinct to retreat into solitude battling with the hesitation that kept him from shutting the door in her face. Something in her eyes stopped him. With a sigh, he stepped aside and motioned for her to enter. The apartment, sparse and unwelcoming, stood in stark contrast to the home they had once shared. Lily's gaze swept over the room, lingering on the unopened boxes in the corner. She didn't comment, but her expression said everything. "You didn't have to come," David muttered, crossing his arms, his voice tinged with bitterness. "I did," Lily replied calmly, her voice unwavering. "I couldn't just sit by and watch you fall apart, not when there's so much at stake." David scoffed and leaned against the wall. "What's at stake? Everything's already gone, Lily. My marriage, my trust, my family, my life, and my best friend. Think about it." Lily shook her head, her voice steady and firm. "Not everything, David. Noah's still here. He's still your son." David's chest tightened at the mention of Noah. He looked away, clenching his jaw. "Is he? He's not mine, Lily. Not by blood. And every time I think about it, it feels like everything I thought I had was a lie." Lily stood, closing the distance between them. "Noah doesn't care about blood, David. He cares about you. You've been there for him every single day. You're the one who's taught him, loved him, protected him. You were his father. Don't let your anger take that away from him." David shook his head, his voice raw with emotion. "You think it's that simple? You think I can just forget everything Sarah did? She lied to me, Lily. She let me believe Noah was mine for years. How do I move past that?" Lily placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him for a brief moment. "I'm not asking you to forgive Sarah. That's your choice, and it'll take time. But don't let her mistakes ruin what you have with Noah. He's innocent in all of this, David. He needs you now more than ever." David's eyes glistened, struggling to keep his emotions in check. "I don't even know where to start, Lily. Every time I look at him, I see the truth. And it hurts." Lily's voice softened, filled with compassion. "Then start with love. Start with the bond you already have with him. Noah doesn't see the truth the way you do. He sees his dad, the man who's always been there for him." David swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words. The silence in the room was heavy, but for the first time in days, he felt the smallest spark of clarity. Maybe the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but he wasn't alone in it. Don't let your pain take that away from him. Or from yourself. David sank into the couch, burying his face in his hands. "I don't know if I can do it," he whispered. "You can," Lily said, sitting beside him, "because you love him, and love is stronger than anger, stronger than betrayal. It's the one thing that can help you both heal." David sat in silence, Lily's words reverberating in his mind. He thought of Noah's laugh, the way his eyes lit up when David called him buddy, and how Noah had always run to him, no matter what. Finally, David looked up at Lily, his voice quiet, yet resolute. "I don't know if I can fix everything, but I'll try. For Noah." Lily smiled, her expression a mixture of relief and encouragement. "That's all he needs, David, for you to try." The room grew silent again, but this time, the silence felt lighter. For the first time in weeks, David felt a flicker of hope, a path forward, no matter how uncertain, for him and Noah. Just then, his phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the stillness of the room. Expecting another work email or a notification, David glanced at it, only for his heart to freeze in place when he saw the name on the screen, Michael Harris. His hand hovered over the phone before he swiped to open the message. The text read, "David, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but there's something you need to know. This has been weighing on me for a long time, and I can't stay silent anymore. It's about Noah. David's chest tightened as he read the next part. I'm involved in Noah's life more than you realize. He deserves the truth, and so do you. I know this will hurt, but I've always felt like I had to step back for his sake. Maybe it's time we both face the reality of what this means for him and for us. David read the message again, his breath quickening. His mind raced with questions. What did Michael mean by involved? How dare he imply he had any role in Noah's life? The life David had poured everything into. His blood boiled as he reread the message, his hands gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. His jaw clenched, and a simmering anger began to rise within him. He had tolerated enough. The betrayal from Sarah, the truth about Noah's paternity. But this was too much. He typed furiously, the screen barely keeping up with his fingers. David, what the hell are you talking about, Michael? You don't get to rewrite history and claim some role in Noah's life. He's my son. I've been there for him every single day. You've done nothing but destroy everything we had. He hit send, his heart pounding as he paced the room. Memories of Noah flooded his mind. His first steps, the way Noah called him dad with such innocence, the bedtime stories, the scraped knees David had tended to. Michael's words echoed in his mind like a cruel taunt. I've been more involved in Noah's life than you realize. What did involved even mean? A few moments of weakness with Sarah, and now Michael thought he was entitled to claim Noah as his own? David's fists clenched, his nails digging into his palms. He couldn't let Michael undermine the bond he had with Noah. He couldn't let this man stake a claim on the child he had raised and loved. David grabbed his coat and stepped outside, needing air to cool the fire burning inside him. But even as he paced the sidewalk, his anger refused to subside. His role as Noah's father was all he had left. It was the one connection that still felt real. And now Michael was threatening that too? The cold air bit at his skin, but it couldn't chill the storm inside him. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. David knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let anyone, least of all Michael, rewrite the truth of his relationship with Noah. Back in his apartment, David sat on the edge of his bed, the silence of the room heavy around him. The events of the day had drained him, leaving him a hollow shell. He was lost in thought when a soft knock on the door broke his reverie. He knew who it was before he even answered. Opening the door, he found Noah standing there, his small frame silhouetted in the dim hallway light. His son's eyes, usually so bright with mischief and curiosity, were clouded with uncertainty and fear. Dad? Noah's voice trembled, and David's heart clenched at the sound. Come in, buddy, David said softly, stepping aside to let him in. Noah hesitated for a moment, then walked into the room. His movements were tentative, as if he were afraid of being scolded. He climbed onto the bed, sitting cross-legged, nervously fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. His eyes didn't meet David's, instead fixed on the floor. Is it true? Noah finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. David's stomach dropped. He had known this moment was coming, but had hoped he could shield Noah from the harsh truths for a little longer. Is what true, son? David asked gently, though he dreaded the answer. I heard you and Mom. Noah's voice broke, and tears welled in his eyes. You said I'm not really your son. Does that mean you're not my dad anymore? David froze, the question cutting through him like a knife. He moved closer, sinking to his knees so he was eye level with Noah. His hands rested gently on the boy's small shoulders. Noah, he said firmly, his voice thick with emotion. Listen to me. I am your dad. I've always been your dad, and I always will be. Nothing changes that. Noah looked up at him, tears falling freely now. But you said I'm not yours, Noah whispered, his voice quivering with hurt. David's heart shattered at the pain in his son's voice. He cupped Noah's face gently, forcing him to look into his eyes. Noah, David said softly, his voice breaking. You are my son. You've always been my son. And nothing will ever change that. You are mine, Noah, David said, his voice trembling with emotion. You've been mine since the day you were born. I was there for your first steps, your first words, every scraped knee and bedtime story. I don't care what a piece of paper says. You're my son, Do you hear me? You're my son." Noah sniffled, his small hands gripping David's shirt as if afraid to let go. "But Mom said—" "Michael." His voice trailed off, and David felt a sharp pang in his chest. David closed his eyes, fighting back the anger that threatened to surface. This wasn't the time for his feelings towards Sarah or Michael to cloud the moment. This was about Noah. "It doesn't matter what anyone else says," David said softly, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "I'm the one who's always been here for you. I'm the one who loves you more than anything in the world, and I always will. Nothing can ever take that away." Noah's tears began to slow, his breathing evening out as he leaned into David's chest, the weight of his emotions shifting. "You promise?" Noah's voice was small, full of vulnerability. David wrapped his arms around Noah, pulling him close, as if to shield him from the chaos outside their small, safe world. "I promise," he whispered. "No matter what happens, you'll always have me." For a long time, they sat in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on both of them. David gently stroked Noah's hair, his own tears falling silently as he realized just how much he needed this moment too. "You're my hero, Dad," Noah said softly, his voice muffled against David's chest. David smiled weakly, his heart aching but full at the same time. "You're mine too, buddy. Always." As Noah drifted off to sleep in his arms, David felt a renewed sense of purpose. No matter how broken his world seemed, no matter how much pain he carried, he knew he had to fight. For Noah, for their bond, and for the future they still had together. The battle with Sarah and Michael was far from over, and David's internal struggle would continue to rage. But in that moment, holding his son close, he felt a flicker of hope. That bond, unshakable and pure, was something no one could ever take from him. The alumni reunion was held in a grand banquet hall of a local hotel, where the soft glow of chandeliers cast a warm light over the bustling crowd. Laughter and the clinking of glasses echoed as old friends huddled together, swapping stories and catching up. The air was thick with nostalgia, a blend of comfort and discomfort all at once. David entered reluctantly, scanning the room with hesitant steps. He had avoided social gatherings like this since his life had been torn apart, but Sam, an old friend, had insisted he come. "You need the distraction," Sam had said. But as David adjusted his shirt cuffs and offered polite nods to familiar faces, a gnawing unease settled in his chest. And then he saw them. Sarah stood by the bar, nervously cradling a glass of wine. Her eyes scanned the room, but when they met his, her face drained of color. Standing beside her was Michael, exuding a calm confidence that made David's blood boil. The sight of them together was enough to send waves of anger surging through him. David's fists clenched, his heart pounding in his chest as the suffocating reality of the situation washed over him. The warm, nostalgic atmosphere now felt like a cruel joke, a reminder of everything he had lost. As though drawn by some invisible force, Michael started moving toward him. Sarah hesitated, her gaze flicking between the two men, but she remained rooted in place, helpless. Michael approached with measured strides, his hands casually tucked into his pockets, his calm demeanor only intensifying David's frustration. "David," Michael began, his voice steady but with an undertone of authority. "We need to talk." David's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. "There's nothing to talk about," he replied coldly, his voice barely concealing the fury bubbling beneath the surface. "For Noah's sake," Michael continued, undeterred, "this isn't about us, it's about him. He deserves to know the truth, to have clarity about his life." David's voice rose, sharp and filled with venom. "The truth? The truth is that you've done enough damage, Michael. You don't get to waltz in here and pretend you care about Noah after everything you've done." Michael's calm facade remained, though his eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm not here to fight with you, David. I'm here because this isn't about us or our egos. It's about doing what's right for Noah." David let out a bitter laugh, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What's right for Noah? You mean after you helped tear his family apart? After you lied and kept secrets that shattered everything? Don't you dare lecture me about what's right for him." The conversation had drawn the attention of nearby guests, and a hush settled over the crowd as curious eyes turned toward the escalating tension. Sarah, still by the bar, looked as though she wanted to intervene, but remained silent, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. Michael sighed, his calm demeanor cracking. "I'm not here to fight," he repeated, his tone now tinged with frustration. David stood firm, his gaze fixed on Michael. "Then why are you here, Michael? You think you could just waltz in and pretend nothing happened? You think you can still have any place in Noah's life after all of this?" The silence in the room grew thick, the weight of the moment pressing down on all of them. David, his emotions simmering, stood his ground. He wouldn't let Michael rewrite the history of his relationship with Noah. He wouldn't let this man, who had helped tear everything apart, make any claim on his son. Not now, not ever. "David, I know you're angry," Michael began, but David cut him off, his voice booming. "Angry? Angry doesn't even begin to cover it." David stepped closer, his voice rising with each word. "You had no right to interfere in my family, in my life, and now you think you can just claim Noah like he's some prize you're entitled to?" Michael's jaw tightened, his calm demeanor slipping for the first time. "I'm not claiming anything, David. I'm trying to step up for him, to be there in a way I wasn't before. You're the one letting your anger cloud what's best for him." David took another step forward, his voice low but laced with fury. "You don't get to decide what's best for him. You don't know him like I do. You weren't there when he took his first steps or when he was sick and needed comfort. You weren't there when he looked at me and called me Dad. I was there, Michael. Me, not you." The tension between the two men was palpable, the air thick with unresolved anger and pain. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, their curiosity piqued by the escalating confrontation. Sarah, standing at the bar, hesitated, her gaze flicking between the two men. She took a tentative step forward, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Please stop. Both of you. This isn't helping." David turned to her, his voice breaking. Don't you dare try to play peacemaker now, Sarah. You're the reason we're standing here, tearing each other apart in front of everyone." Sarah flinched as though struck, tears welling in her eyes. "I never wanted this, David. I never wanted any of this." David's laugh was bitter, his pain spilling out in his words. "Well, congratulations, Sarah. You got it anyway." Unable to take it anymore, David turned sharply and stormed toward the exit. The crowd parted for him, their hushed whispers trailing after him as he pushed open the doors and stepped into the cool night air. The cold hit him like a slap, but it wasn't enough to quell the fire raging inside him. He paced the empty parking lot, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps. The confrontation replayed in his mind, each word from Michael and Sarah cutting deeper into the wounds that hadn't even begun to heal. He stopped and leaned against his car, his hands gripping the edge of the roof as he stared out into the darkness. The night was silent, the distant hum of traffic the only sound. For a brief moment, David closed his eyes, letting the stillness wash over him. He thought inwardly about Richard's words. Being social really helped get the situation handled. Even Marty called AJ to deal with the death of his friend. But the pain remained, the betrayal, the anger, the sense of loss. It all clung to him, suffocating and inescapable. He knew he couldn't outrun it, couldn't escape it, no matter how far he went. And yet, in the quiet of the night, David realized one thing. For Noah's sake, he had to find a way to face it. The knock at the door was hesitant, almost timid, but in the silence of David's apartment, it sounded deafening. He glanced up from the cup of coffee he had been nursing for hours, his brows furrowing. He didn't need to check who it was. He already knew. Slowly, reluctantly, he stood and walked toward the door. When he opened it, Sarah stood there, her shoulders hunched as if bracing herself for rejection. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face pale. She clutched the edges of her coat tightly, her knuckles white, as though holding on for courage. "David," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, I know I'm the last person you want to see, but I need to talk to you. Just give me a minute." David's jaw tightened, his emotions swirling in a storm of anger, pain, and something he couldn't quite name. For a moment, he considered slamming the door in her face. But then he thought of Noah, his bright eyes, his trust, his laughter, and stepped aside. "Fine, he said curtly. "You got a minute?" Sarah entered cautiously, her movements tentative, as though she feared even the space itself would reject her. She stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, wringing her hands as her gaze flitted around the sparse apartment. The weight of what she'd done seemed to press down on her, making her seem smaller. "David," she began, her voice breaking. "I don't even know where to start. I've been replaying everything over and over in my head, trying to figure out how I let things get this bad, how I hurt you and Noah so deeply." David crossed his arms, leaning against the counter. His eyes were cold, his voice sharp. "Did you find an answer? Or are you here just to throw more excuses at me?" She flinched, the words cutting through her defenses. "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "I'm not here to make excuses. There's no excuse for what I did. I was selfish, weak, and I made mistakes that I can never take back." David's lips pressed into a thin line, his anger barely contained. "Mistakes? You think what you did was just a mistake? Do you even understand what you've done, Sarah? You didn't just betray me. You broke us. You broke our family." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she nodded. "I know, David. I know. And I hate myself for it every single day. I don't expect you to forgive me. Not now. Maybe not ever. But I can't just walk away from this without trying to fix it. Without trying to fix us." David let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Fix us? Sarah, do you even realize how much you've destroyed? Do you really think an apology is enough to fix this?" Sarah took a shaky step forward, her hands trembling as she reached out, then hesitated, letting them fall back to her sides. "I don't think an apology will fix anything," she admitted. "But I need you to know that I'll fight for this. For you. For Noah. I'll do whatever it takes to prove that I can be better. David, I can be the person you and Noah deserve," Sarah said, her voice breaking. She covered her face with her hands for a moment before looking up again, her eyes raw and pleading. "Noah needs you. He loves you so much. You're his dad in every way that matters. Please, don't let my mistakes take that away from him." David's chest tightened at the mention of Noah. Images of his son, his laughter, his trust, the way he called him dad, rose unbidden in his mind. His resolve wavered, and he looked away, unable to meet Sarah's gaze. "You think I don't know that?" he said quietly, his voice rough. "You think I don't lie awake every night, wondering how the hell I'm supposed to be his dad after all of this, after finding out he's not mine?" Sarah stepped closer, her voice soft but urgent. "He is yours, David, in every way that matters. He doesn't care about biology. He cares about you. And I know I've ruined so much, but I'm begging you, for him, don't let this destroy what you have with him." David turned to face her, his eyes filled with pain. "And what about us, Sarah? What do you expect me to do with all of this? With everything you've done?" "I don't expect anything," she whispered. I need you to know that I'll do anything to make this right, even if it takes the rest of my life." David stared at her for a long moment, his emotions warring within him. Anger, betrayal, love, guilt. They all collided, leaving him exhausted and unsure. But through it all, one truth remained: Noah. Finally, he spoke, his voice hesitant but steady. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Sarah. I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust you again. But for Noah's sake, I'll try." Sarah let out a shaky breath, her tears falling freely now. "Thank you, David," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't thank me," he replied, turning away. "This isn't for you. It's for him." As Sarah nodded and quietly left, the door clicked shut behind her, leaving David alone in the silence. For the first time in weeks, though, the silence didn't feel quite as heavy. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was a start. David sat on a park bench, watching Noah dart between the swings and the monkey bars. His son's laughter rang out across the playground, pure and untainted. For the first time in weeks, David felt a flicker of peace. Noah's smile had been rare lately, clouded by confusion and sadness. But today, it was bright and genuine. David had made it his mission to ensure more days like this. "Look, Dad," Noah called, climbing to the top of the play structure. His face lit up with pride as he balanced on the narrow beam. "I see you, buddy," David called back, a small smile tugging at his lips. He gave an exaggerated thumbs up, and Noah beamed. Since his conversation with Sarah, David had thrown himself into creating stability for Noah. He rearranged his work schedule to pick him up from school, sign him up for soccer lessons, and even started a weekend tradition of pancake breakfasts. These small rituals were anchors, keeping Noah's world steady in the wake of the upheaval. David also made time to talk to Noah, ensuring he felt safe to express his fears. "It's okay to feel sad or confused," David told him one evening while helping with a school project. "But I'm always here, no matter what." Noah nodded, his small hand clutching David's. "You won't leave, right?" "Never," David said firmly. "I'll always be your dad. That's a promise." After the park, Sarah arrived at David's apartment to pick Noah up. She waited by the door, hesitant but calm as David ushered Noah out with his backpack. "Thanks for letting him stay the extra night," Sarah said softly. David nodded, keeping his tone even. "It's for him. Noah needs to feel loved and secure. That's all I care about." Sarah sighed, her gaze falling to the ground. "I know, and I appreciate that we're doing this together. For him." David crossed his arms, his voice firm but without malice. "Let's be clear, this isn't about us. I'm doing this because Noah deserves a family that works, even if it's not perfect. But it doesn't mean I'm ready to forgive Sarah. Don't read more into it." She nodded, her expression a mixture of guilt and understanding. "I won't. I'll keep trying to be better for both of you." David didn't respond immediately, instead watching Noah climb into Sarah's car. "Let's keep the focus on him," he said finally. "That's what matters." As Sarah drove off, David turned back toward the apartment. He knew there was a long road ahead, but for now, his priority was clear. Noah's happiness. And that, at least, was something he could fight for. The apartment was quiet, the kind of silence that pressed down heavily, amplifying every creak of the walls and the faint hum of the refrigerator. David sat by the window, the soft glow of the city lights filtering in, casting long shadows across the room. He cradled a mug of coffee in his hands, its warmth grounding him as he stared out at the street below. People moved about their lives, walking dogs, chatting in groups, laughing without a care in the world. It was a scene of normalcy, the kind David had once taken for granted. For the first time in a long while, David allowed himself to believe that, maybe with time, things could get better. For Noah, for them both. Now everything felt distant, unreachable almost. David took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the bitter taste linger on his tongue, while his thoughts spiraled like the steam rising from his cup. The pain was still there, raw and jagged, a constant reminder of what had been taken from him. The betrayal, the lies, the security he had once believed in. It all seemed like a faint memory, something almost too far removed to touch. Yet, as he sat there, something subtle began to shift. The sharp edge of his anger had dulled, just a little. His mind wandered to Noah, the one bright light amidst all the darkness. He remembered the boys' laughter from the park, how Noah had clung to his hand so tightly, and that whispered plea, "You won't leave, right?" That moment had stayed with David, clinging to him like a lifeline. In that instant, he realized what truly mattered. David leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. He let his mind replay memories of happier times. Sunday mornings flipping pancakes, Noah perched on the counter, giggling as he tried to sneak chocolate chips into the batter. Sarah's laughter echoing through their home, a sound once filled with warmth. Though those memories still brought an ache to his chest, they no longer felt unbearable. He opened his eyes and stared at the mug in his hands, the word forgiveness echoing softly in his mind. Could he forgive Sarah? Could he ever truly move past what she had done? David wasn't sure. Forgiveness, at this point, seemed like an abstract concept, distant and foreign. But for the first time, he understood that forgiveness wasn't about her. It was about him. Holding on to the anger, the bitterness had consumed him, leaving him exhausted and hollow. Letting go, even just a little, felt like the only way forward. He took a deep breath, exhaling slowly as he allowed himself to acknowledge the small glimmers of hope that had begun to pierce through the darkness. His bond with Noah was unshakable, something even the hardest truths couldn't break. And though Sarah had betrayed him, she had shown a willingness to try to make things right for Noah. Healing would take time, but perhaps it was a journey worth pursuing. David wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. The wounds were still too raw, the scars still forming. But for the first time, he could see a path forward, even if it was shrouded in uncertainty. He set the mug down and stood, stretching as he moved toward the bookshelf by the wall. He pulled out a framed photo of Noah, one of his favorites. It was from their trip to the lake last summer. Noah grinning ear to ear, his face smeared with marshmallow from the s'mores they had made. David traced a finger along the edge of the frame, a small smile tugging at his lips. Noah deserves a family that doesn't fall apart, he murmured to himself. The words weren't just a resolution, they were a promise. A promise to fight for the moments that mattered, to rebuild something stable for his son, even if it wasn't the life he had once imagined. David returned to his seat by the window, the photo now resting on the table beside him. He stared out into the night, the quiet hum of the city filling the room. The pain was still there, but so was the hope. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. David stood at the edge of the park, watching Noah run toward the swings, his laughter ringing out across the cool evening breeze. Sarah stood a few feet away, her hands in her coat pockets, watching their son with a mix of hope and quiet regret. The air between them wasn't warm, nor was it cold. It was filled with an unspoken understanding, one that neither was ready to articulate. Their conversations had become pragmatic, focused on schedules, school events, and ensuring Noah felt loved and supported. It wasn't forgiveness, at least not yet, but it was a step, however small, towards something less fractured. Sitting in his apartment that night, David found himself staring at the photo of Noah on his desk. It was the same one he had held just days earlier, from their summer trip to the lake. The boy's smile reminded him why he had made the decisions he had. The road ahead is long, David thought, leaning back in his chair. But maybe, just maybe, we can find a way to move forward. He let his thoughts drift, revisiting the moments that had defined the last few months. Sarah's betrayal, Michael's unwelcome presence, the overwhelming pain of seeing his carefully built life crumble. It had all been too much, and yet, through it all, there was Noah, a constant reminder of the love that had once existed and could still exist, even in a different form. David reflected on the lessons this journey had taught him. Trust, once broken, wasn't easily repaired, but it wasn't impossible either. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or excusing the past. It meant choosing not to let it dictate the future. He'd also learned that love could take on many forms. His love for Noah was unconditional, unshakable, even in the face of revelations that had tested every fiber of his being. And while his love for Sarah was something far more complicated now, he couldn't deny that it still existed, albeit buried under layers of hurt and mistrust. Most of all, he realized that healing wasn't a destination. It was a journey, one step at a time. He didn't have all the answers, and he didn't need to. What mattered was that he was willing to try. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time, David felt as if he could face it one day at a time. Co-parenting with Sarah had become a fragile equilibrium, a constant push and pull between the past they had lost and the present they were trying to navigate. Some days the wounds felt sharp and fresh, as though the betrayal had just happened, while other days the ache was more distant, a dull echo of a pain that might one day fade. David didn't know if true reconciliation was possible. He didn't know if he could ever trust Sarah again. But they both shared one unshakable goal, Noah's well-being. And for that reason, they continued to move forward, even if the steps were slow and uncertain. That night, as David stood by Noah's bedside, watching the steady rise and fall of his son's chest, a quiet sense of peace washed over him. Noah's face, calm and innocent in sleep, filled David's heart with a purpose that cut through the chaos of his own emotions. In that moment, he realized what truly mattered. This, he thought, watching his son, this is what matters. Not the past, not the pain, just this. David understood that the path ahead would be difficult. There would be setbacks, days when the burden felt too heavy to carry, when the weight of everything threatened to drown him. But there would also be moments, small but significant, of joy, connection, and hope. He slowly moved back to his chair by the window, gazing out at the twinkling city lights. The noise of the world outside felt distant, muted by the clarity that had settled over him. He thought of Noah, of Sarah, and the family they were trying to rebuild, piece by piece, in an imperfect way. "The road ahead is long," David whispered, his voice barely audible in the stillness of the room. "But maybe, just maybe, we can find a way to move forward." For the first time in months, David allowed himself to believe that it was possible, that despite everything, they could find a way to heal, to rebuild, and to be whole again. And so, as David continues down the long and difficult road of healing, one thing becomes clear. Life may not always go as planned, but the people we love and the connections we still hold can guide us through the darkest of times. Co-parenting with Sarah, despite the pain, is still a step towards something better for their son. Sometimes moving forward isn't about forgiveness. It's about finding the strength to keep going for the ones we care about. Thank you for watching this heartfelt story on Reddit Cheating Stories. If you found David's journey moving or relatable, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real-life tales of betrayal, healing, and growth. And as always, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. How would you handle a situation like David's? Let's talk about it. Until next time, stay strong and take care.